Good evening and welcome to Scotland at 7 here on Broadcasting Scotland. My name's Kenny McBride and I'm joined this evening by two excellent guests. Firstly by Jim Fairley, a farmer, founder of Scotland's first farmers market and also a prospective SNP candidate in Perthshire South and Kinrossshire. Jim, how are you doing this evening?
I'm very well, Ken. It's lovely to be here again. Thank you very much for having me.
Well, thanks for joining us. And on the other side, we have one of our more regular guests, writer and academic Effie Samara. Effie, how are you doing?
I'm good, thank you, Kenny.
Excellent. Well, it's good to have both of you here. And we start this evening, as we always do, with our coronavirus update. So as of 2 p.m. today, a total of 862,993 people in Scotland have been tested through NHS Scotland labs and UK government regional testing centres. Of these, 821,737 were confirmed negative, 41,256 were positive. There were 1,297 new confirmed cases of COVID-19 in Scotland today, and sadly, there were 7 new reported deaths. This will, of course, be an underestimate of the total number of cases, as not everyone with the virus will display symptoms, and not everyone who has the virus will necessarily be tested. We do urge you, of course, if you are showing new symptoms of a dry persistent cough, a fever, or a change in your sense of taste or smell, then please do book a test as quickly as you can. You can also download the app, Protect Scotland, from protect.scot. That helps with contact tracing if you are in contact with somebody who has a positive test. Of the people who have tested positive, there were 527 people in hospital last night, 35 of whom were in intensive care. And the number of patients in Scotland who have died from complications caused by the coronavirus infection now stands at 2,557. This number only includes those who have died in hospital having received a positive test for the virus. The latest UK daily figures available show that 43,018 patients who tested positive for COVID-19 have sadly died from their illness, an increase of 143 since yesterday. This number refers to deaths in all settings, not just in hospitals. And we also have a report from the Office for National Statistics on deaths registered in England and Wales for the week ending October 2nd, which was week 40 of the year. In this week, there were 321 deaths registered in England and Wales where the novel coronavirus was mentioned on the death certificate. This is an increase of around 50% from the 215 reported in week 39. Of these, 25 were in Wales, an increase from 12 in the previous week. It is worth noting, though, that again, the 321 registered deaths in England and Wales for this week is notably lower than the 345 recorded in the UK government's daily reporting. This happened for several weeks earlier in the pandemic, and we were advised by the ONS that this was down to delays in producing death certificates. However, it does not yet appear that ONS reporting has ever caught up with many of these deaths, reported in the daily figures but not appearing in the later and theoretically more complete ONS report. There has been a persistent pattern of lower than average deaths in hospitals and care homes for some weeks now, counterbalanced by higher numbers of deaths in private homes. This pattern's even more extreme this week, as there were 233 fewer deaths than the 5-year average in hospitals and 81 fewer in care homes, but this was significantly outweighed by 725 more deaths in private homes than the 5-year average. And before we go on with the rest of this evening's stories, just to remind you, if you'd like to join the conversation here, you can do so on Twitter by following us at Broadcast Scot and using the hashtag Scotland at 7. That's hashtag Scotland AT and the number 7. And as you can see, we'll be flashing some of those tweets up on the screen as we go through the show. But our first story tonight, the SNP has criticised Boris Johnson's government for firing the starting gun on a post-Brexit race to the bottom, after it rejected a crucial amendment to the agriculture bill that would have prevented current high standards being watered down in order to secure trade deals. The amendment brought forward from the Lords aimed to enshrine current domestic standards into legislation and would have looked to strengthen, not lower them. The move would have prevented low-quality produce from entering Scotland being sold in our shops, and key Scottish industries from being undercut and undermined. However, the Tory government ignored concerns raised by health experts, farmers and food producers and consumers, and voted down the amendment to the bill. So, Jim, I think we'll come to you first on this. As a farmer, what does it do to you when you see that the Tories are so unwilling to do anything that would put our current high standards into law and make it harder for them to be lowered?
Uh, it doesn't surprise me in the slightest. We've been warning against this since 2016. That when the powers come back from Westminster, from the EU, they would be placed in the hands of Westminster. And if the UK government were looking to do trade deals with countries like America, then the likelihood is that they would take whatever deal they could get. And if that meant sacrificing animal welfare standards, food standards, labelling, or anything else, they would do it in order to get that deal. So it doesn't surprise me. It doesn't. I can't say I'm disappointed because disappointment doesn't cover it. They are not doing anything that I didn't expect of them. And Douglas Ross's token gesture last night by voting against the government, it was nothing more than a cheap publicity stunt. He voted against the first parish amendment, which would have effectively done the same thing. It would have guaranteed that no product brought into this country would have been produced to a lower standard than what we have in this country. He voted it down, as did the other 5 Tory MPs in Scotland, who are all representing rural constituencies. He voted against the government last night with the Curry Amendment, which would have brought any it would have meant that anything would have had to be passed by Westminster in order to allow it to come into the country if it didn't reach the same standards that we have in this country. So you have to kind of look at the pattern here with Douglas Ross's behaviour, because he voted against the government once before, just prior to taking over the leadership of the Tory party in Scotland. Now he's voted against the government again, and he has voted against it. His 5 colleagues, or the people who should be living with Douglas Ross's decisions, voted against them. So does he not have control of them? Does he not? Is he not able to lead his own colleagues in the Tory party in Westminster? Why did he do it? It was clearly a publicity stunt. Had the government been in any danger at all of losing this vote, he would have voted with the government. I think he has so blatantly showed himself up to be nothing more than a charlatan as far as this is concerned. He's trying to curry favour with the farming communities and the rural communities in Scotland, but the reality is he's trying to cheat us, and it just simply isn't going to wash.
Yeah, George Eustace, the Environment Secretary, did say after the vote that action wouldn't be taken against Douglas Ross for voting against the government whip on the basis that he was just a backbencher voting with his conscience and therefore that was okay. It's kind of an odd situation where the leader of the Scottish Tories can, as you say, have his colleagues vote against him. He votes against the government line, and yet he's just a backbencher, so it doesn't matter.
Yeah, I tell you what he's actually done. He has brilliantly demonstrated the total impotence of Scottish MPs in Westminster. So therefore, why are we there? If things are going to be imposed on Scotland, it can be done with a majority government in England, bringing in policies that we don't vote for. They're a party that we don't vote for. We have a government we didn't vote for. And the leader of the party in government in the UK has absolutely no control about undermining the fastest growing sector in our economy, the food and drink industry, and yet he's powerless to change it. And yet he wants us to settle with that and to have Westminster's ideology imposed on Scotland. And he has simply demonstrated today that even he, as the leader of his party in Scotland, is totally impotent to do anything about it. It was a pathetic, stupid stunt, and I think it'll backfire on him massively.
And George Eustace also said today that the legal protections weren't necessary on the basis that the government had already given assurances to the National Farmers Union that standards would be upheld. How is the NFU, and particularly NFU Scotland, responding to that now? Is there something else that the union expects to do or expects to happen now?
I heard Andrew McCormick being interviewed on Radio Scotland this morning, and he said he was very disappointed. If that is the strongest response that we're going to get from the NFU from a farming industry, then we're doomed. They need to be far more vocal. They need to be far more proactive, and I think they really need to be raising their concerns vocally with the public and letting them know that they're devastated by this. The National Farmers Union are absolutely devastated by this, because it means that product can be sold into this country with a much lower food production standard than we have to produce in this country. And they will clearly be, this is not something that's new. We've been talking about this for a long time. We can have much lower standard product delivered into Scotland and into the UK. And because the UK Internal Market Bill, if it comes into England, then we have to be able to sell it here in Scotland, which is going to undermine the decades of work that we have put in to building up the world-class reputation that we have for our food and drink sector and for our farming sector. And this absolutely rides a coach and horses through the entire thing. So the NFU, for my money, as a member of the National Farmers Union of Scotland, I want to see them being far more vocal about it. I want to hear their very loud, very vocal protests and make it in no uncertain terms that they are more than a bit disappointed with what the UK government are trying to do.
Well, I'll just turn to Effie quickly on this one. Effie, as Jim says, this vote by Douglas Ross against the government line and against what all the other Scottish Tory MPs voted, is it, do you think, just a publicity stunt, just a kind of fig leaf for him to hide behind saying, oh, but I support Scottish farmers?
Well, it's hard to have anything to add really to what we've just heard by Jim. I mean, I have to echo every single statement that he made. I will add one small point, which I tweeted about yesterday, and I got quite a big reaction. It was Gavin Williamson's point. As you know, I am attached to the University of Glasgow, and in regards to the Internal Market Bill. And I know this takes us away a little bit from the agricultural point, obviously, in the rural communities, which is essential at this point, and it's to do with our foods and our health. But even going a little bit away from that, the audacity and just the pure abomination of him. I mean, it was actually Carol Monaghan who asked him, is this going to threaten the fact that Scottish universities do not charge tuition fees? And he simply stood up and said, what we are one nation. We are a united nation, and we will do whatever is efficient. He did not answer the question, but in my judgment, this was very much about making an official declaration that actually, if it's for the good of Westminster, we're gonna start charging tuition fees if that's what we judge to be good. So bad things are coming our way on the basis of that bill, and it's really hard to encompass it all in half a minute, Kenny.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, we don't have a lot more time to talk about that story, as we do have to move on now. The SNP has said that the Tory government must U-turn on its reckless plans to scrap the furlough scheme at the end of the month, as UK unemployment rises to the highest level in 3 years. New analysis from the Office for National Statistics has revealed that the UK unemployment rate grew to 4.5% in the 3 months to August, compared with 4.1% in the previous quarter, while redundancies have risen to their highest level since 2009. The number of redundancies is expected to rise further if the Tories scrap the furlough scheme this month, with analysis from Citibank suggesting unemployment could hit 8.5% in the first half of 2021. Alison Thewlis MP said Scotland now faces a Tory winter crisis of soaring unemployment and an extreme Brexit being imposed against our will. The SNP's Shadow Chancellor said that with the Tory government blocking investment and the devolution of financial powers, the only way to properly protect Scotland's economy is to become an independent country. Jim, I don't suppose I'll find you arguing with that last line, but do you see any hint from the British government that an extension of the furlough scheme is even possible now?
No, quite simply no. I think Rishi Sunak's announcement last week that I think they're calling it the job protection scheme. I think that's the phrase that they're using, particularly in the hospitality industry. The hospitality industry in Perth and Kinross, we were the second highest recipient, I think, in Scotland of furlough scheme wages in order to protect jobs here in this area. And that's because it's very much a service sector economy we have here in Perth and Kinross. There are huge numbers of people employed in the hospitality industry. If they had even done some kind of sectoral protections, because the hospitality industry, the value to our economy is massive, and yet what he's proposing is, I think they're going to pay about 2/3, but the employer has to pay 1/3 of the wages, and they have to have them in for a certain period. But how do you do that when your business has been shut down? How do you bring people into work when there isn't the capacity for them to be there? So it's a wholly ineffective system that they're putting in place, and the bonus of having £1,000 if you keep a member of staff on till next year. Most businesses, a lot of these businesses, are not going to make it through till next year. So once the furlough scheme ends, I think we are going to see a rash of redundancies right across, particularly the hospitality sector, which will affect this area massively. And there has to be some way of us to be able to protect it. And we've had Kate Forbes, who has continuously said, you need to give us the powers in order to do what's right for the people here in Scotland. But it kind of comes back to the internal market bill. They want a homogenous system across the whole of the UK. They won't allow us to do our own thing in order to protect these jobs. And yet they're going to allow one of the biggest growth sectors that we have in our economy to be laying off tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people. So absolutely, the only way that we can do that is to protect ourselves through independence, and that's what this next election will be about in 2021.
Well, you mentioned the hospitality sector, so I will just bring in our next story before I come to Effie. An SNP MP led a debate in the Commons today highlighting the UK government's woeful lack of support for the events sector during the coronavirus pandemic. Owen Thompson MP used his debate on fiscal support for the events industry to outline the industry's anger at the UK government's failure to engage in the pressing issues faced by the sixth biggest economic sector in the UK. Prior to the pandemic, the UK's creative industries were growing at 5 times the rate of the economy as a whole. Few companies have been able to secure funding as part of the UK government's £1.57 billion fund. And with many workers reliant on the UK furlough scheme, which is due to end this month, the MP has warned of an exacerbated jobs crisis if the Westminster government fails to act. The SNP has called on the UK government to extend the furlough scheme and introduce a meaningful package of fiscal support for the 3 million freelancers who have yet to receive a penny in support from the Tory government at Westminster. And Effie, coming to you on this now, the hospitality sector has really been put in a very difficult position, hasn't it? Not only is it facing extra restrictions now in terms of trying to deal with the pandemic, but it's also going to be still one of the most restricted industries once we get past the end of October, past the end of the current restrictions. And there are still going to be a lot of hospitality jobs that just can't go back. What do you think is holding back support for particularly those 3 million freelancers?
Well, it's first of all, it's ideology, Kenny. This is a government who like to pride themselves on their neoliberal ultra-capitalist credentials. So the idea of support and help to them is anathema. And basically, it's a eugenicist view of the world. It's very much about the survival of the fittest. And in terms of the hospitality industry, they try to almost, tweak it a little bit. We saw what was happening with, for example, the Tim Martin's business, with the Weatherspoons pubs or whatever it was. They're trying to facilitate that as opposed to other things. But as Jim said just a moment ago, this is not going to support the hundreds of thousands of people that could potentially be losing their jobs through this winter. But you did mention something else, which was events and the creative industry. And I will just simply take one sentence to give you the figures now. in 2019, I believe the UK creative industry was worth about 116 billion. Now that tells you, for all the people that cannot or would not actually be supported through this crisis, with Mr. Cummings' ideas about ballerinas and the different Tory ideas about creative people, musicians, and what have you. This, if you divide that by month and hour, it brings in, and the calculation here, I must be correct, it's about 13 million to the UK economy every hour before COVID. This is a huge industry, and it's a fantastically viable industry. But again, ideology gets in the way, and they don't like the creative industries. So again, we're seeing a huge lack of support. And I'll be honest with you, this money is actually going to go elsewhere.
Mm. And when you look at this, I mean, how concerned are you about the future of the creative industries if, for example, theatres aren't able to get back for another 6 months or longer, if music venues aren't able to open? How big an impact do you think that's going to have in the longer term if so many artists do have to go and retrain as whatever the government tells them to?
I don't know if you've been on the website for retraining. So I did, prompted by the amazing Alison Phipps, who is my boss at Glasgow University. I think it was recommended to her that this is a woman who holds a doctorate in various areas. She's written 20 books and speaks 19 languages. And I think the Home Office website said that they couldn't find a recommendation for her. Well, they did for me, and they said that I could retrain as a boxer. Now, you've met me, Kenny, and I don't think that would be a viable option. So this is basically, I'm trying to illustrate the lunacy and, bring a smile, hopefully, to people's faces, because to answer your question, I have dire news. I did say before, the creative industry is a huge, it's actually possibly one of the few UK industries which all across the UK, and I'm talking about London because I was in the creative industry in London for a long time. I'm talking about the Scottish creative industry, which has another momentum, a huge big momentum, about Irish writers, about poets, about actors, about music. It's a fantastically vibrant, viable, profitable industry. What's going to happen is, I don't know if you saw the news earlier today, I think they said about 15 billion is going to France off the back of, the financial services. The exact same thing is going to happen within the creative industry. So many people, I must have known hundreds of people who just could not wait to get to London to perform part of the Royal Symphonic, part of the Royal Ballet. All of these people are now looking to leave. And obviously, we're talking about Brexit here, but when you're letting that industry hemorrhage, and the way they're doing it just now is vindictively so, there will be a consequence, and the consequence is, will trickle down, and then the catering industry, and then all the people with different skills, crew, all of these people, they will suffer. So it remains to be seen, but I will, I suppose, end that short sort of passionate statement with what Jim said. We've got to hope for something better up here, independence. If independence is coming our way, then there is a bright future ahead of us. Otherwise, my God.
Yeah, and I will just add,
just Ken, if you don't mind,
Sorry,
just
Jim,
making a point. The downstream industries from the creative industry is absolutely massive. It's huge. A large part of our business is through the creative industries. We do outside catering to big festivals and events, and it was wiped out overnight. And there is absolutely no support. We're fortunate that we can now do street food from the unit that we have. But I know lots of guys who are in this industry who have had no support whatsoever, whether they're in the catering side or in the creative side or in the construction side of the festivals and events that would happen all over Scotland. There's been no support for these people. They are desperate. They're absolutely desperate. It's that core group of people who make the creative industries work in Scotland going to lose. And it takes years to build up that level of experience and that level of competence. and we are in danger of losing a whole sector of the industry. And how do you build that up again overnight? So it's not going to be a quick fix by any stretch of the imagination, unless there is some kind of government intervention which allows these people to stay in the country and wait for us to be able to get the industry back up and running.
Yeah. Well, we move on now, and families in Scotland are facing destitution following years of austerity, and universal credit has exacerbated poverty, say two national children's charities, prompting SNP MPs to renew calls for the UK government to strengthen the social security system. New research from NSPCC Scotland and Bernardo's has found that between 2013 and 2019, during which universal credit was implemented, poverty has remained the core issue, but that more families were experiencing destitution. The report also raises concerns that the current pandemic will compound the situation in Scotland. The SNP's Shadow Work and Pensions Secretary, Neil Gray MP, has repeatedly urged the UK government to strengthen the social security system by turning universal credit advance payment loans into non-repayable grants, and also to scrap the 5-week wait for the first payment. The SNP has proposed that the advance payment would become a non-repayable grant once the claimant had been deemed eligible for universal credit, and could be determined on a sliding scale basis dependent on need, but all would receive an upfront payment to see them through until the first payment. There's overwhelming support for this proposal, including from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, the Trussell Trust, Leonard Cheshire, Human Rights Watch, the Citizens Advice Bureau and the Child Poverty Action Group. SNP MPs have also urged the UK government to strengthen the social security system by maintaining the universal credit £20 increase and extending it to legacy benefits, as well as scrapping the poverty-inducing benefits sanction regime and benefit cap, which has prevented people from benefiting from that universal credit £20 increase. Jim, I don't think many people would be shocked to learn that the introduction of universal credit hasn't reduced poverty, given the way that it's structured. What do you expect to change now that this research is out there?
From the Tory government in Westminster? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. I think the proposals that are being put forward are very sensible. But I very recently went to a charity shop in Perth, and I was speaking to the woman there who's basically holding that charity shop. It's a swap shop where the people will hand furniture in, and they're giving it out to. It's an area where I used to live, and they're giving it back out to people who have got nothing. And I was delivering leaflets up there for a local by-election, and I was struck by, when I lived there, it was, there was some parts of it were fairly rough, but I was struck by how there is some grinding poverty, and in this period just now, there is grinding poverty available that you can see in the streets, in the places where these people are living, and it's like, why are we allowing this? And the women told me about various situations where, a young girl has come in, she's got a 3-year-old baby, a 3-year-old child, and she's just had a baby, but she's only got one mattress. So she needed a mattress to be able to put the 3-year-old on so that you could give the baby a mattress and give the 3-year-old a mattress. I mean, God almighty, what kind of country are we living in where that's okay and that's acceptable? And there was another lad who told me about, he has mental health issues, he's got physical health issues, and he was coming into the charity shop now and again, he was basically pottering. And she said to him, look, we've got things that we need getting done around here. Would you like to give us some help? And he said, yeah, I'd love to do that. And it was about giving him, something to be a part of. Mm-hmm. And she made an amazing statement. She said, one of the things that we have to do in this charity shop is we've got to see people like him. Because if we don't, nobody else will. And they'll become invisible. And it's because of an ideological Tory position of creating this so-called universal credit that's going to help us all. Well, by God, it's not helping these people that I was seeing in the housing estate in Perth. They're living in grinding poverty and in real danger of disappearing from the system completely because there's nobody looking out for them other than charity shops, food banks. I mean, it's an absolute disgrace that we're living with that in these days. But I don't see anything changing with the Tory government we have placed in Westminster right now.
Mm. Well, we'll move on to our next story because it is somewhat linked. SNP MP Ronnie Cowan will today lead a Westminster Hall debate on the introduction of a universal basic income, saying that it's indefensible for the Tories to obstruct this potential solution to poverty after imposing a decade of brutal austerity policies. The SNP has repeatedly called for the UK government to introduce a basic income pilot in Scotland to help ensure a strong and fair economic and social recovery. The Scottish Government has already commissioned some of the most detailed research ever on how to implement a UBI scheme in Scotland and confirmed on the 21st of May 2018 that it would provide £250,000 over 2 years to support the undertaking of a study of a UBI pilot in Scotland. The SNP, the Scottish Government and others have urged UK ministers to engage with them on this, given welfare and tax powers remain at Westminster. The UK government has so far refused. And Effie, Ronnie Cowan obviously has been on this show several times talking about UBI. He introduced the first ever debate on UBI at Westminster Hall, and now he's trying again. Why do you think that the Tories are so against this idea when we know that it's potentially more fair, reaches everybody, it's less of a nanny state sort of issue than the kind of intrusive universal credit regime? It potentially boosts new business startups, all of these positive things. What is it you think that's stopping the Tories from even allowing a pilot into this?
We know what Conservative, it's not in the Tory, this particular Tory party is not even Conservative, Kenny. They are ultra Conservatives. They are, in my judgment at least, and I will say this in my capacity as an academic, they tick all the boxes for neo-fascism. So what happens there is you have, as I think I mentioned it before, a eugenicist view of the world. So it's very much about survival of the fittest and about segregating the population into people who have power, and they are usually a top slice of the population, people who are connected to the governance, whatever that may be, the ruling party, in this case, a far-right party under Boris Johnson and Cummings. And they are connected to each other, and they act as puppets to each other. So they're compromised by these situations. And then you have a huge big populace who can very easily be controlled. Now, the higher the poverty rates, the easier the control, the degree of control that you can exert on people. And all the points that you made are absolutely precise and certain. Now, UBI, I will also add the idea of, better health. If you have an income that can be secured, the idea of the idea of security, of knowing that you have a roof over your head, the idea of less appearance in the rental market and more property ownership, the idea of better childhood and infancy health. So all of these things are hugely important. And I mean, it goes on and on. UBI, for anyone who's interested, is a huge, big subject. And there is very little room to find fault with it. They will never, ever commission a study into it because they know all this. But this is about power and ideology. I mean, we know what happened during lockdown to the top 0.3% billionaires in this country. They augmented their wealth by another obscene percentage. Now, the people that Jim was just referring to a moment ago, and I was literally nearly in tears when he was talking about the young women with the 2 children who was unable to provide mattresses for both. This is a country which is amongst the top 7 countries in the world. This not only should not be happening, there is no reason in logic why this is happening. This country prints money, and they can address this within 24 hours. That needs not be happening, but it is. So, for those still doubting why, I think, the proof is in the pudding.
Yeah, and I'm sure we will have Ronnie Cowan back on the show sometime very soon to talk about his efforts at Westminster. But we do move on now. And Germany today demanded substantive movement from the UK on fisheries, dispute settlement and fair competition guarantees in post-Brexit trade talks with the EU, which it said were at a very critical stage. With the looming December deadline to put new trading arrangements in place, German EU Affairs Minister Michael Roth said the EU was working hard for a deal, but was also ready to trade from 2021 without an accord to avoid tariffs or quotas. We are at a very critical stage in the negotiations and we are extremely under pressure. Time is running out, Roth said as he arrived for talks about Brexit in Luxembourg with ministers from the 27 member states. That's why we expect substantial progress by our friends in the United Kingdom in key areas, in particular on governance, the level playing field, and fisheries. EU leaders hold a summit in Brussels on Thursday and Friday to assess progress, and Prime Minister Boris Johnson has said he wants to know by October the 15th if a deal can be reached by the end of the year. So Jim, I'll come to you first on this. We've heard this October deadline several times, but we know that the EU, when it comes to these kind of negotiations, often will go into what they call the tunnel, where they just go into all-night talks, very secretive, until they finally emerge with something. Do you think that's likely to happen at this stage now, or do you think there are still too many barriers that the EU is just not willing to give up on?
No, in reality, I think they will. Push. They'll keep pushing on this. I don't think just the mood music. I know there's a lot of rhetoric flying around at the moment, but I think the reality is they're probably going to keep pushing until they get some kind of negotiated movement down the line. I'm not quite sure that they're actually going to succeed, but there is always a bit of brinkmanship when it comes to EU negotiations and big trade deals. That's just par for the course. Mm-hmm. But there does seem to be a very hard line from both sides on this. So I'm not convinced we're going to get any progress, but I think we're definitely at the moment. I think what we're doing is we're doing the dance, and we're just going to have to wait and see. They say a week's a long time in politics. 24 hours is a long time in EU negotiations. So, I think it's safe to say that there's nothing's decided until it's decided. So until we hear one way or the other, I don't think we can draw any conclusions at all, because there's a lot of gamesmanship going on at the moment.
Yeah. And Effie, from your point of view, what do you make of these negotiations? Do you feel like we are edging towards some sort of deal, or do you think this could all still fall apart?
I think there will be some sort of agreement, purely, as Jim said, because without anything at all, you could be facing literally the closure of the port of Dover and airports and things like that on the 31st of December. And both sides are aware of this. Now, on this side, we could also be facing the calamity of no food and no medicines, which, I mean, you've had Philippa Whitford on the show, and she's gone through all the different challenges faced by the pharmaceutical industry, especially in the middle of COVID. I think there will be something. As Jim said, they are still dancing, but we know, given the red lines, and we know what the red lines are, because this UK government are hell-bent literally on getting their unfair competitions, their rules, on getting their US situation going with whatever they think is going to happen there. The big pharmaceutical companies, all the places and all the industries that they're compromised to, they need to keep them happy. So given the red lines there, we will get probably a very basic, lamentable deal when life will bear no resemblance to how we've lived it for the last 45 years,
Well, we move on now to the other side of the Atlantic, and President Donald Trump's Supreme Court nominee, Amy Coney Barrett, began the first of 2 days of direct questioning from US senators today, telling senators that her religious views would not affect her decisions on the bench. The Senate Judiciary Committee hearing presents Barrett with a chance to respond to Democratic opponents who have been unified in opposing her, primarily on what they say would be her role in undermining the Obamacare healthcare law and its protections for patients with pre-existing conditions. Barrett was nominated to the lifetime post on the court on September 26th by Trump to replace the late Liberal Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Republicans have a 53 to 47 Senate majority, leaving Democrats with little to no chance of blocking Barrett's confirmation. If confirmed, Barrett would tilt the Supreme Court further to the right, giving conservative justices a majority of 6-3. She will be Trump's third Supreme Court appointment. And Effie, if I could come to you first on this, it's a really interesting point, this idea that people are being asked to set aside their religious beliefs in order to be justices. What do you make of that? Do you think this is, as the Republicans have argued, an attempt to kind of purge religion from the public sphere?
They're hardly succeeding with this appointment here, the proposed appointment, Kenny. I've actually, despite other commitments today, I've watched a lot of that debate with her, and what's interesting is that the main points that have come through were precisely to do with her religious position, i.e. her position on abortion and the question of Wade and Roe, which is a big precedent in US legislature. Now, Connie Barrett is the thing about her is that she advocates something which is called textualism in statutory interpretation, and originalism in constitutional interpretation. Now, this is, I'm not going to take time. I'm only going to say this is a little bit like time traveling when you're talking about judicial review. So she says if the founding fathers said this in 1768 or 1821, they meant it to be taken as literally. Now, this is obviously a laughable position because we have moved on from that time, and some of the ideas that would be considered very normal in those days now can be considered quite brutal. People's rights have moved on. Black Americans should now be considered full citizens of the United States. Now, with someone who's upholding these positions, it is incredibly difficult to get impartial judgment. She was also questioned on her endorsement of Anthony Scalia. Now, Scalia is known for not his consistent position in not upholding the Affordable Care Act. And we know what that means in terms, again, of a puritanical way of interpreting healthcare, of believing that people who have money also deserve health. So if you don't have money, you're a bad person and therefore you don't deserve health. And obviously one of the last points that was made, and I literally just stopped it just before I came on tonight, was about gun control. And again, she's very, very much in favor of what they consider to be the Fifth Amendment, which is private ownership of guns in America. And we know what this leads to every year. We're talking about thousands of deaths. We're talking about infants raising guns and killing their grandparents because these guns are just lying about in people's houses. And again, her position is very, very clear. She is in support. Now, the problem here is that if you watch her performance, all she does is sidestep, innovate. But this is very much to me the person, the reaction of a person who knows that she's got the job. So not great.
And just to clarify there, it's the Second Amendment that refers to gun rights. The Fifth Amendment is the right to avoid self-incrimination. But we will move on now. And the United Nations World Food Programme will need to raise $6.8 billion over the next 6 months to avert famine amid the COVID-19 crisis, the agency said today. The WFP, which was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize last week for its efforts to prevent the use of hunger as a weapon of war and conflict, said it had so far raised just $1.6 billion. We've got a lot more money to raise to make certain we avert famine, said David Beasley, the executive director of the food programme, at a conference organised by the UN's Food and Agriculture Organisation. Beasley noted that 7 million people had died from hunger this year as the COVID-19 pandemic, which could double hunger worldwide, claimed a further 1 million lives. If we don't sort out COVID, hunger death rate could be 3, 4, 5 times that, said Beasley. The World Food Programme says it helps some 97 million people in about 88 countries each year, and that 1 in 9 people worldwide still do not have enough to eat. After declining for several decades, world hunger has been on the rise again since 2016, driven by the twin scourges of conflict and climate change. And Jim, this is quite a stark warning from the World Food Programme, isn't it? I mean, but the world does produce enough food to feed everyone. Why are we still having people going hungry in this day and age?
In the midst of a global pandemic, failing rains, droughts, floods, it seems to me that the world has gone absolutely nuts at the moment, to be honest. Wildfires in America and Australia. We are going to face increasing challenges in producing. It's not that we don't produce enough food, it's about how we distribute that food, I should say. But we're going to be facing more and more natural disasters because of climate change as well. So there are major global issues that we're going to have to tackle head on. I think that the Scottish Government's ambition that they've set out with their Green Deal and the programme for government is very welcome. But there is going to have to be global working together to be able to try and, I don't know if we're not going to solve it overnight, but we certainly have to look for solutions to be able to just allow people the dignity of being able to have enough food in their bellies. And we can only do our bit that we can do in this country, as far as we're concerned in Scotland, because ultimately the UK is the global ambassador on our behalf until such time as we become an independent country. So for us to be able to play our part, I would say let's hasten our rush towards independence, so that if we are going to be taking part, then we can do it with a fair and just thinking government sitting in Edinburgh.
And Jim, just to bring this back a wee bit closer to home, we know obviously that climate change is having a serious impact in a lot of parts of the world, making, as you say, droughts and floods a lot more common. How big is climate change as a factor in Scottish agriculture? How much do we need to worry about this kind of stuff here?
I think everybody needs to worry about it, Kenny. I think that anyone who's a climate change denier is just not facing up to what's happening. There has definitely been a season shift. I've noticed it in my lifetime in farming. There has been a seasonal slip, whereas you used to you knew that you had a winter, you knew you had a spring, you knew you had a summer, you knew you had an autumn. And it seems to me that, if you go over the annual patterns, things are definitely moving. We're definitely getting warmer. We're definitely getting wetter. I think it's an issue for every single one of us, and I think the climate change targets that we've set here in Scotland are admirable. But that's something that we're going to have to do on a global level rather than just ourselves doing it here in Scotland. Doesn't mean to say we can't be world leaders. Doesn't mean to say that we shouldn't be setting a very high standard that we follow. But we really do need international agreement on how we're going to go forward with it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we come back to Scotland now with a bang, and the Scottish Government is to provide a further £4 million of emergency funding for Glasgow Subway and the Edinburgh trams in response to the ongoing financial impacts of the pandemic. The latest emergency measure is in addition to the £9 million announced in July and will be in place until the end of 2020 to support services throughout this period. It follows detailed discussions with Strathclyde Partnership for Transport and Edinburgh Trams regarding available resources due to the unprecedented impact that COVID-19 has had on travel demand. These discussions have been undertaken in light of the published COVID-19 Framework for Decision Making and the Transport Transition Plan. So, Effie, is this the right move from the Scottish Government and maybe first steps towards a more holistic approach to how we do public transport in Scotland?
Yes, of course. And obviously, let's not forget the COVID question is very much still with us, and it could be for another year or two. So public transport is the way for most people. Obviously, up here in Scotland, a lot of people, because some of us are rural, we have to have cars. But this kind of support, I think, is essential. Personally, I applaud it, and obviously, given the limited fiscal powers, I wish I could see it sort of replicated across the sectors. But great news.
Mm. And Jim, we've seen with the rail sector that the UK government has effectively nationalised the rail system again. They are now classed as public sector workers and public borrowing when they borrow money. Do you think this is going to present a chance for the Scottish government and potentially even the UK government to change how they approach public transport? Do you think there is going to be real change happening on the back of this?
We're going to have to wait and see, Ken. And obviously, the Scottish government looked at taking ScotRail into public ownership last year because of, or was it the previous year, because of performance problems. But I think there is definitely a mood to look at the position of taking it back into public ownership. Just because it's such an essential service. It's one of these things that we're constantly criticising, we're constantly hearing complaints about it's too expensive and all the rest of it. So there is definitely a mood to have a look to see whether or not that's the right way to go with our public transport system. And to take it back into public ownership. But we will have to, there is going to be so many changes that come out of what happens if we get to the other side of COVID, or if we learn to live with COVID. And we're right now in the eye of a storm, so I don't think we can predict too much at the moment about with any certainty about where we're going to land up with anything. But there is definitely a mood to look at have a real shake-up of the transport system in this country. I don't doubt that for a second.
Well, we move on now to our final story of the evening, and applications for the self-isolation support grant have opened for low-income workers who are asked to self-isolate and would lose income if they need to. The £500 grant will help those who have been asked by Test and Protect to isolate following a positive test for coronavirus or having been in close contact with someone else who has tested positive. These payments are designed to help people self-isolate for the required period to stop the spread of the virus, but who would face financial hardship due to being asked to self-isolate, and will be targeted at those in receipt of universal credit or legacy benefits who are employed or self-employed. The local self-isolation assistance service is also being introduced to support people needing to isolate, as well as being able to self-refer for support through the existing National Assistance Helpline. Local authorities will now proactively contact those being asked to self-isolate to offer help, advice and assistance, including help to access essential food and medication or local support services. And that number for anyone who needs it is 0800 111 4000. So Effie, just quite quickly on this, this is got to be a positive for anybody who's struggling with self-isolation, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Fantastic. £500, I'm going to, not to put a dampener on it, but I think they could be a little bit more generous. I'm talking about the UK government here, possibly on this, especially for people who have had to deal with COVID, given that now we know that there is also the condition of long COVID, and some people are dealing with symptoms still 6-7 months down the line. But absolutely, great news for those who are awaiting to receive it, and let's hope that perhaps it can be replicated or maybe slightly increased in future.
Yeah, and Jim, I mean, it does highlight the Scottish Government trying, as it has been, to do its best for people, but somewhat limited, as Effie says, in being able to put that amount very much higher because of the limits on finances.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of if you consider what we're trying to do here, trying to stop a global pandemic from moving, and you're in a contracts on minimum wage, and you're struggling to get by as it is, and you get a phone call out of the blue from a test and trace worker saying to you, you've come into contact with somebody, probably in a hospitality sector, as a working in a coffee shop or whatever, and they're asking you to now self-isolate with no income. You think of what that would feel like. You cannot work. Nobody's going to be paying you. So the fact that the Scottish Government are doing this is admirable, and it's fantastic. But the reality is we need to have the powers to be able to make sure that these people will stay at home and they're not forced to go out because they haven't got enough money to live. It must be a desperate situation to be having a phone call from a test and tracer to say you need to now self-isolate, and there's nothing wrong with you, you're not feeling ill, but you're having to self-isolate, and you're living on a 0-hour contract on minimum wage, and you're struggling to pay the wages as is. The 500 quid, yeah, I get it, it's a great bonus, but as Ev said, it really needs to be more generous, and it needs to be a public health issue that we're paying for to try and keep people at home to stop the spread of the virus. So we need to have the powers that would allow us to make better decisions. And I keep coming back to it. That comes from us being an independent country.
Well, that seems like a perfect place for us to end. Thank you very much, Jim and Effie, for joining us. Just before we go, I will just remind you that number, if you do need it for self-isolation support, is 0800 111 4000. You can find that online as well if you just Google National Assistance Helpline. But that is, as I say, just about all we have time for. So thank you to Effie and to Jim, and thank you at home for joining us as well. There's no point in making these shows if we don't have an audience. So thank you very much for being with us. We do have to ask, if you're able to support Broadcasting Scotland, then do please go to broadcastingscotland.scot/register. Sign up there as a supporter, and your £5 a month helps us do everything that we do here at Broadcasting Scotland. Everything that we're trying to build here relies on that support, so do please support us if you can. If you're not able to, we do understand, and we promise you the shows will always be free to view online, but you can still make a big difference by following us on Twitter at Broadcast Scot, by liking our Facebook page, by subscribing to our YouTube channel and clicking the bell icon to make sure you're notified when we put out a new video. And then share these shows around with your friends and family. Let them know why you support Broadcasting Scotland, why you think they should give us a try. Word of mouth is the best possible way to spread the word. And we're also looking out for new volunteers here. It's becoming very difficult for us to manage everything here at Broadcasting Scotland without more people. So if you're able to help out either in front of the camera or behind the camera, then we would absolutely love to hear from you. You don't need any skills to start off with. We can definitely train you. We just need a wee bit of enthusiasm from you. And just finally, before we go, we just wanted to give a wee shout out to Paul Kavanagh, better known but to most of you as the wee Ginger Doug. He experienced a stroke, we think, last night. He's in hospital. He is recovering, but we understand it is going to be a difficult recovery for him. So I'm sure everybody who knows Paul, who knows his work, will agree with us that we really want him to get well soon. So all the best to Paul. But that is all we have time for tonight. I will be back again tomorrow night at 7. But in the meantime, thanks once again to Jim Fairley and to Effie Samara. Thank you again for joining us, and have a great evening. Good night.
Thank you.